I never thought the forest I had heard about since childhood could be so terrifying. Listening to the elders, I laughed at their stories, dismissing them as mere fairy tales for children. But now I know how wrong I was. I will never forget that night. Since I was a child, I lived in a village bordering a vast forest. Its dense canopy formed such a thick cover that even on sunny days, twilight reigned within. The elders claimed the forest was cursed. They spoke of a mysterious creature that dwelled there, and how those who ventured deep into its heart never returned. My name is Alexei, and I never believed those tales. I was certain the elders were just trying to scare us youngsters. But one day, I decided to prove to everyone that the forest was just a forest, and the horror stories were just stories. That evening, I was sitting around a campfire with friends. We were laughing, joking, and someone once again started retelling one of the old forest legends. "Do you even believe in that stuff?" I asked, looking at Sergey, a guy who loved to scare us with such stories. "Of course I do," he said passionately. "Do you think all those people just disappeared for no reason?" "People disappear for all kinds of reasons," I replied, trying to sound confident. "But if you want, I can prove there's nothing scary about that forest." "No way," he scoffed. "Are you seriously going to go in there?" "Why not?" I said, without thinking. "I'll walk to the old hunter's cabin and back. I'll bring something as proof." The others exchanged glances. Some laughed, others shook their heads. But I had already made up my mind. I wanted to prove that fears were nothing but foolishness. As I entered the forest, an eerie silence enveloped me. Not a sound, not a rustle. Even the birds were silent. The towering trees seemed to close in above me, blocking out the moonlight. The wind crept low, stirring the grass and bushes, casting strange shadows. I walked confidently, holding a flashlight in my hand. I had a knife in my pocket and a small amount of food and matches in my backpack. I knew the journey to the cabin would take no more than an hour, but the forest seemed to mock me. Step by step, the silence became more oppressive. The first sound I heard was a rustle. To my left, somewhere in the bushes, I froze, quickly turning and shining my flashlight in that direction. Nothing, just the dense branches of a bush swaying in the wind. I tried to calm myself. "It's just an animal," I thought. But then the sound came again from the opposite direction. My heart started pounding faster. I forced myself to keep walking, convincing myself it was just my nerves. The path to the cabin felt like an eternity. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the stronger the sensation grew that I was being watched. Occasionally, I thought I saw eyes gleaming in the distance, but when I pointed my flashlight at them, there was nothing. Finally, I reached the cabin. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by gnarled, ancient trees. Moonlight barely penetrated the area, leaving it shrouded in deep shadows. The cabin looked worse than I expected. Broken windows, a moss-covered roof, and a door hanging by one hinge made it a true monument to abandonment. Cautiously, I approached the door and pushed it open. The creak was so loud it made me flinch. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Old, faded rifles hung on the walls. A table in the corner was piled with papers, and shards of glass littered the floor. As I searched the room, my attention was drawn to strange marks on the walls. They looked like deep scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. My heart raced. In the corner, I spotted an old rifle. It looked intact enough to take as proof of my visit. Just as I picked it up, I heard a sound, a low, guttural growl from just outside. I froze, directing my flashlight toward the window. At first, I saw nothing, but then, on the edge of the light, a figure flickered. I barely made out its outline, a tall, twisted silhouette with long limbs. Its eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light. My heart stopped. The creature took a step forward, and I heard the crunch of branches under its feet. It moved slowly, as if savoring my fear. I stepped onto the porch, holding the rifle in one hand and the flashlight in the other. For a moment, everything was silent. Then it rushed toward me. I hurled the rifle in its direction and ran blindly. The forest became a nightmarish maze. I don't remember how long I ran. Branches whipped my face, and my legs burned with exhaustion. But the terror drove me forward. Every sound seemed to signal the creature closing in. At some point, I stumbled into a small clearing. Moonlight bathed it, but I felt no relief. I knew the creature was near. It appeared at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. I froze, unable to look away. It moved toward me, each step an eternity. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the night. The air grew thick, as if something unseen was binding me. I couldn't move. I don't remember how I found the strength to run again. Perhaps it was pure survival instinct. I ran, tripping and falling, until I saw the faint lights of the village. When I reached the village, the residents gathered around me. I was covered in dirt, disheveled, and trembling. For a long time, I couldn't speak. Finally, I managed to stammer, "It's here. It's here." The hunter's footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the forest. And then I realized, no one can save me but myself. The forest presence became more oppressive with each passing day. The whispers outside my window grew louder, and the shadows within the trees seemed darker, more alive. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew the truth. One night, I woke to the sound of crying. It wasn't the same low, mournful wail I'd heard before. It was a child's voice. The cries were quiet, pitiful, like a plea for help. They came from the direction of the forest. I lay in bed, trembling, torn between fear and a sense of duty. What if it really was a child? What if someone was lost and needed help? But I couldn't ignore the fear that this was another of the forest's traps. The crying continued, growing louder. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. The village was silent, with only the wind rustling the leaves. The cries led me to the edge of the trees, where the dense shadows swallowed the moonlight. "Who's there?" I called, my voice unsteady. The crying stopped abruptly. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. They were coming toward me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and ran back to my house, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed my back against the door, listening intently. For a moment, there was silence. Then a slow, deliberate knock echoed through the wood. Knock, knock, knock. I held my breath, my mind racing. The knocking stopped, but I felt a presence outside, something watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. In the days that followed, I became a prisoner in my own home. I locked every door, barred every window, and rarely ventured outside. But no matter how hard I tried to avoid the forest, it seemed to find ways to reach me. Strange noises echoed in the distance, and shadows moved in the corners of my vision. One morning, I found a small, withered branch placed neatly on my doorstep. It was tied with a strip of cloth, stained dark red. My stomach churned as I realized the cloth looked eerily familiar. It was from the hunter's coat. I didn't dare touch it. The villagers began to notice my increasingly erratic behavior. They whispered behind my back, calling me paranoid, saying that I'd gone mad after my night in the forest. But I didn't care. I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. Weeks passed, and I began to notice changes in the forest itself. The trees seemed taller, their branches more twisted. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the forest was alive and watching. Animals no longer wandered near its edge, and the villagers avoided speaking of it altogether. One evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. If the forest wanted me, it would have to face me. Armed with a lantern and a knife, I stepped into the trees, determined to confront whatever it was that had been tormenting me. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Just an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I walked for what felt like hours, my lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the gnarled trees. Eventually I came to a clearing. In the center stood a large, ancient tree, its trunk scarred with deep, claw-like marks. At its base lay objects, broken tools, torn clothing, even a child's toy. They were offerings, I realized, left by those who had been claimed by the forest. As I approached the tree, I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw it, a tall, hunched figure with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its movements slow and deliberate. The creature stared at me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if it was peering into my very soul. "You don't belong here," it rasped, its voice a guttural whisper. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The creature stepped closer, and I realized there was no escape. My lantern flickered, its light dimming, as the shadows around me grew darker, thicker, until they consumed everything. I woke up at the edge of the forest, the morning sun warming my face. My lantern and knife were gone, and my clothes were torn and dirty. The villagers found me wandering aimlessly, muttering incoherently about the forest. They tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew I was marked. I don't know how I survived that night or why the forest let me go. But I do know one thing, it's not over. Even now, as I sit in my house, I feel the forest's presence. It watches me, waits for me. I hear its whispers in the wind, its footsteps in the night. And I know, deep down, that one day it will come for me again.